In this series so far, we have done an overview of what geopolitics is and its relationship with history, and we have explored some models for both. In this presentation, we are going to further explore these ideas by looking at what popular history calls the Great Game. Now, if you do a quick search on the internet, you will find that the Great Game refers to the geopolitical rivalry between Tsarist Russia and British India for control of Central Asia in the 19th century. But this is only part of the story. We will widen our scope of time and space and examine the historical processes set into motion that affected not just one region, but created in a sense the modern international system on the Eurasian megacontinent. Now I am your host G.S. Goraya, and welcome to this concluding part of the art of geopolitics. Now, when John Mearsheimer wrote his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he used the term tragedy for a reason. The tragedy of great power politics is summed up by the phrase, uncertainty of intentions. Because one actor in the international system does not know what his opponent will do, one must assume his opponent will do the worst. Therefore, every actor on the international stage must prepare for the worst. And also, as Paul Kennedy reminds us, this is important because the rise of one great power is always coterminous with the fall of another. So, you have to prepare for what your rival is doing, because if you want to persist as a great power in the international system, you have to prevent the rise of your competitor. So this is going to be the key dynamic that we will explore in the Great Game. The structure of this talk is largely built around telling a narrative history of the rise of the two empires, British India and Tsarist Russia, and how they build their rivalry through this clash of perceptions and the uncertainty of intentions. Now, since we mentioned tragedy, let us begin with death. The death of Peter the Great, the first Tsar of Russia. In January 1725, the winter in Russia was even gloomier than usual. The empire was in mourning for its first emperor, Peter. Peter had been Tsar of Russia since 1696, for a few years before he had ruled jointly with his stepbrother. But in 1721, he had become Russia's first emperor. The Russia that Peter had inherited had been a kingdom set in the middle of the West Eurasian plain. Since the era of the Scythians, numerous kingdoms have risen and fallen and have become quaint artifacts of history in this region. The Huns, the Cumans, the Avars, the Khazars, even the Grand Lithuanian Empire. Now Russia could have easily become one of these. Instead, it became a behemoth. And how did this happen? It happened because of the reign of Peter the Great. Now, if you know something of Peter, you'd know that he was known as a reformer. What he was an institution builder. I'm not going to talk about his cultural reformation of Russia, but in terms of the web of geopolitical power that we've discussed recently, Peter focused on streamlining and organizing scattered Russian industries and various parts of his society to build Russia and make it into a war machine. He streamlined these industries for war production, making, among other things, cannon foundries, powder mills, musket factories, leatherworks, textile mills, and instituting mining operations. In fact, within Peter's lifetime, Russia's pig iron production, which is a marker of industrialization in this era, had equaled that of England's and soon surpassed that of his other regional rival, Sweden. In fact, it was in a war with Sweden that Russia would emerge as a great power. Now, in the 17th century and in the beginning of the 18th, it was Sweden which one would have expected to become the great European power, at least in the northern regions of Europe. Sweden wasn't just restricted to the peninsula but controlled significant territories in northern Europe. It had a powerful army and a navy, and the Swedish army was in fact so strong that it was regularly knocking out opponents even if they had a 3-1 advantage in various wars. And led by the King Charles now, Sweden was on the verge of great powerhood. Now, in the Great Northern War, two alliances were pitted against each other. For most of the war, Russia, along with Denmark and some minor allies, were fighting against Sweden, who was supported on and off in a minor way by the Ottoman Empire and England, but in the later stages of the war. In the beginning, Sweden was going at it all alone. Now, Russia's goal in this war was to gain access to the Baltic, so Peter would have a port to access the oceans of the world, while Sweden, led by the warrior King Charles, was occupied in northern Europe against Denmark. Peter quickly gained territories in the Baltic, and even before the war was over, began to build his dream city of St. Petersburg. Now, Charles knocked out a few opponents in northern Europe and moved into Russia, and dealt one severe blow to the Russian army, almost annihilating it completely. Here, St. Petersburg was at threat, and everything Peter had strived for was on stake. But the institutional reforms that he had set into motion a few years ago now came to his help. The war machine that he had built quickly allowed him to recover. He built a new army, and while the war raged on for 21 years, the positive feedback loops he had created on the geopolitical web of power, with his industry supporting his military and both being supported by his economic reforms, he was finally able to defeat Sweden, but after 21 years. Now, where had Peter gained the inspiration for these reforms which allowed Russia to emerge as a great power? Most of it was his own unique nature, but just after becoming sole Tsar of Russia, he had gone on a grand tour of the West, especially spending time in Holland, and then crossing the seas to visit a man whom he considered something of an idol, William III, also known as William of Orange. Now, in January 1698, a young Peter, who had been traveling incognito around Europe, was approaching London by sea. He saw a sight which enamored him. Docked in the harbour was a forest of masts of hundreds of ships. It was said on any given day there were 2,000 ships docked at London, a fraction of the merchant fleet that sailed the waters of the earth. In 1698, 10 years after he had deposed the previous King James in the Glorious Revolution, England had been transformed by William from a medieval island kingdom into a mercantile power. Now, some of the ships Peter saw in London probably belonged to the East India Company. The East India Company had been trading in India for almost 100 years. But for most of its history, it was a fledgling player in the Indian Ocean trade. And even some individual merchants in India had more ships than the entire EIC. But things were about to change. Some reforms instituted in England came to the aid of the East India Company, especially the monetary reforms being carried out by Isaac Newton and John Locke, not just the greatest minds of the era, but in fact possibly the greatest minds of the world. And these monetary reforms, the orientation of England towards trade, and some geopolitical events happening in India in the beginning of the 18th century, created the conditions for England to rise as not just a major trading power but a major geopolitical player in the Indian Ocean. Now, in the beginning of the 18th century, as the sea power of England and the land power of Russia was in its nascent stages, another world empire was collapsing. The Emperor Aurangzeb was the last great emperor of the Mughal Empire, and he had died in 1707. He had extended his empire to its furthest extent, but it came at a cost. In his final years, he had been campaigning to put down an uprising of the Marathas of central India. Even as he died and his successor was barely secure on the throne, a rebellion by the Sikhs broke out in Punjab. The north and the west of the empire were in flames. It took 2 decades and 3 emperors to put down the rebellion of the Sikhs. But disorder in the north had opened up the route for a new threat. A new emperor of Persia struck in the north, even as the Marathas seceded to build a vaster and vaster kingdom of their own. Nadir Shah, the emperor of Persia, dealt a killing blow to the Mughal Empire, occupying the capital Delhi and allowing the remaining vassals of the Mughal Empire to break free. But almost immediately they began fighting amongst themselves, opening opportunities for the British and the French to make some gains in coastal enclaves. Now, the East India Company had briefly tried to use its naval power to conquer some enclaves in 1690 when Aurangzeb was still at the peak of his power. Aurangzeb had ultimately trounced the East India Company by besieging its factories and forts, but the brief war known as Child's War gave the English in India some important lessons. First, sea power was not going to be enough to make gains in India. They would have to develop land power too. Second, they needed allies in this foreign theatre. The other geopolitical lesson was that the Mughal Empire, which had failed to build a navy, was an empire that was on the brink of collapse. It had failed to invest in new technologies to adapt to new terrains, in this case oceanic space. It was bound to fall as a regional power. In fact, as a great power. Returning to the EIC, through bribery and diplomacy, for the next few decades, this is what they managed to do. They managed to do something which would have made Sun Tzu and Machiavelli proud. They maneuvered themselves into positions, built local alliances, and it all came to fruit in the Carnetic Wars of the 1740s, as the English and their allies trounced the French and their allies, took some coastal enclaves, and in 1757, using the network connections among banking houses and merchants in India, the EIC, through intrigue and combining land and sea operations, managed to install a puppet ruler in the province of Bengal. In the defining Battle of Plassey, the EIC, working with two merchant houses of Bengal, got a commander leading a bulk of the opponent forces to switch sides. They made him the new Nawab, and in subsequent years, managed to eliminate not just all their rivals, but also sidelined the allies and killing some of them. Bengal gave the EIC both a bridgehead and a winning strategy. In the next 4 decades, using their twin doctrines of land power and sea power, with diplomacy and intrigue, by quickly deploying locally raised armies across theatres in western and eastern India, they managed to steamroll local land powers in India. Not just geostrategy, but ruthless geoeconomics came into play. Every territory that the EIC captured was sucked dry of resources to raise new armies. So it is important to note that the nexus between geostrategy and geoeconomics is not always benign. Unless it is motivated by a sense of justice, it can lead to devastation on an unimaginable scale. Now, by the beginning of the 19th century, the EIC had defeated most of its major Indian rivals. What independent powers remained were forced to sign subsidiary ally status with the British, which made them, in reality, puppet states of the East India Company. The only Indian territories which remained north of Delhi were the dominions of the Sikh Empire. The Sikhs had once been disunited, but they were being consolidated into an empire by the great emperor Maharaja Ranjit Singh, known as the Lion of Punjab. After 40 years of relentless conquest, for 50 years the East India Company's northern borders would remain fixed at a mutually decided boundary between the Empire of Punjab and the East India Company. The board had been set. The second round of the great game was about to begin. Now, what was going on in Russia at the time? In the decades after Peter's death, he was succeeded by some minor czars, interspersed between 3 great Tsaristas: his wife Catherine I, his daughter Elizabeth, and finally Catherine the Great. The strong empresses were building on the legacy of Peter, and Catherine had extended Russian rule permanently into the Caucasus by annexing territories from Persia, which had been fought for on and off since Peter's last days, also claiming some territories in the Ottoman Empire and extending Russian rule into Central Asia. Now, Russia's great land army was almost unstoppable, even in the European theatre where they made substantial territorial gains. Catherine claimed, "I shall not die until I have ejected the Turks from Europe, suppressed the pride of China, and established trade with India." Of course, she did a lot, but she died before fulfilling either of her promises to herself. Now, even as the grand chessboard of geopolitics was being set up in Asia, a major player who threatened to turn everything on his head was entering the stage in Europe. In the decade of the 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power. After consolidating his rule in France after his campaigns in Italy, he crossed the pond of the Mediterranean and invaded Egypt. Napoleon, like most men who aim at being world conquerors, styled himself after Alexander the Great, and no one can seriously emulate Alexander unless you conquer India, ignoring for the moment the fact that Alexander never did. There was some indication that Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was a stepping stone towards an invasion of India. He had maintained some diplomatic contact with the warrior king Tipu Sultan of Mysore. If Napoleon did attack the British in India, he would have to strike out across the Arabian Sea. For this, he would either have to build a new fleet or transport his fleet from the Mediterranean overland to the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea. But that option was taken out of the equation as a British naval campaign by Horatio Nelson destroyed Napoleon's Mediterranean fleet. So he chose the second option and made a secret alliance with Paul, the new Tsar of Russia who succeeded Catherine. The plan was to strike at India overland through the heart of Eurasia. But another question one might ask is why India? Remember the geoeconomics and geostrategy nexus. India, with its commanding position at the head of the Indian Ocean, commanded trade to the east and the west. Trade and power went hand in hand in the new global economy, and we see more and more of this in the modern world. This, the geoeconomic nexus and the mastery of geoeconomics, is now the key to dominating the international system. And we see that perhaps even in our times when geoeconomics has perhaps become more important than geostrategy. Now, things didn't get going from Napoleon's side, but Paul in 1801 organized an army and an invasion of India. He sent out an army of 20,000 Cossacks to march through Central Asia to the Khanates of Khiva and Bukhara and strike at the British in India. Now, Peter had actually sent an expedition to Khiva too in 1716. His intention was to get to the river Amu-Darya, map it and fortify key locations. Initially, the expedition launched by Peter the Great had been moderately successful. They reached the river, began mapping it, and began construction of 2 forts on either side in strategic locations to allow for crossing. Peter was very adept at using rivers for internal transport in continental Eurasia. He had used rivers remarkably in his Crimean campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, using them to supply his troops who marched along them. He even built a few proto-gunboats to use in battles. Till the arrival of railways, rivers were the highways of continental transport. Now, Peter's attempt to hold the Amu-Darya had failed after a counterattack by the Khan of Khiva. Paul's expedition, on the other hand, with no knowledge of the terrain, no way to supply the army or send backup sources, was foolish to begin with. But he died before the army set off and the new Emperor Alexander called off the invasion. Subsequently, relations between France and Russia broke, Napoleon invaded Russia, and the story of Napoleon's defeat by a coalition is a long one. But for the British in India, there had been 2 threats now, which took the principle of uncertainty that Mearsheimer mentioned to red alert. Now, uncertainty can only be countered through control. So for the next few years, the British strategy in India was to create an architecture of control in a system of allied or puppet frontier states, which would act as a buffer against any invasion. So in 1808, the Governor General of British India sent 3 embassies, one to the Kingdom of Punjab, an immediate northern neighbor, the Sikh Empire, the second to Persia, a more distant neighbor which occupied a key position, and the third to a more mysterious kingdom of Kabul, which was the Afghan Empire of Ahmad Shah Durrani. Over the next decades, the Kingdom of Kabul, as it came to be known, played a major role in the Great Game and became a major theatre of rivalry between the 2 great powers, especially because it was constantly contested by Persia in the west and the Sikh Empire in the east. In the decades following the embassy, the Sikh Empire gobbled up huge chunks of Afghanistan. The king of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad, after failing to retake a key city of Peshawar, approached the British for an alliance against the Sikhs to help him recover this city, which was not just one of the richest provinces in the region but had been the original homeland of the Afghans. Now, the British, for whom the Sikhs were more important than their architecture of control in the frontier, refused, and Dost Muhammad, the Amir or the king of Afghanistan, began to approach the Russians. So the British chose the next best option. They launched the First Anglo-Afghan War, sent an army into Kabul to install a puppet king, Shah Shuja, who had been sent out of Afghanistan and was wandering in India. The First Anglo-Afghan War was a disaster. A British garrison had been installed in Kabul to protect the new puppet king Shah Shuja, but civil unrest broke out soon after. Not only was the king murdered, the entire British garrison, which had been positioned in Kabul, was killed, picked out by snipers and raiders as they marched out of Kabul trying to make their way back into India. For the next few years, the British adopted what was called a policy of masterly inactivity on the frontier. This changed in 5 years, as a new opportunity arose to build the architecture of control on the frontier. The old king of Punjab, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, died. There was a new revolutionary fervor in Punjab, as the army of the Sikhs threatened to depose the ruling dynasty and set up a military republic. Now, the European experience of the French Revolution foretold what such a state would portend. So, at the slightest invitation from the regent Queen of Punjab, the British invaded to defeat the army and support the dynasty. A revolution and discontent raged on in Punjab for 5 years, till a new war broke out. The East India Company deployed almost all its regiments in this new theatre, using Punjab's rivers and the Ganges River to supply troops and even bringing up a gunship up the Indus River to aid in the siege of a strong fort at the city of Multan. The British outfought and, more importantly, outsupplied the Sikhs, showing the might of their war machine in India. In 1850, Punjab was annexed. The frontier moved north, and in the meantime, Russia too had begun to annex more territories in Central Asia. In the next 2 decades, the Russian Empire annexed all the remaining Khanates of Central Asia, including Khiva and most of Bukhara. All that remained between the two empires was Afghanistan. There was a new geotechnological dynamic at play in Russia's expansion into Central Asia: railways. In the 1870s, the famous Trans-Caspian Railways was becoming from an idea into a reality. There was also a geo-economic logic behind Russian expansion into Central Asia. In the 18th century, Russia's desire to expand into Central Asia was motivated by the search for rumored gold in its rivers. Now the land and the soil of Central Asia became the prize. The vast fields of Central Asia were said to be the most conducive for growing cotton, a prized commodity in world trade, especially after the American Civil War. So here, geoeconomic calculations and world trade were a driving force behind geostrategy. Russian expansion into Central Asia prompted another British war with Afghanistan. For some years, wars raged all across Central Asia. Now, Britain too was backed by railways. The vast manpower and strategic geographical positions in Punjab, the new line of the frontier which cut into the southern reaches of Afghanistan. As Russia continued to push towards the northern borders of India, Britain began to push upwards. There was a second Anglo-Afghan war. Afghanistan was forced to cede key strategic locations along the Hindu Kush mountains. Railway lines were laid and fortified cantonment towns were built to protect the northern frontier. Since the beginning of the 18th century, the British Empire in India had moved its borders almost 1,000 kilometers northwest. After the Second Anglo-Afghan War, Afghanistan had become a nominal British puppet state, which it remained till the Third War in the beginning of the 20th century. If we add Afghanistan to this number, the British Empire had expanded northward by almost 1,500 kilometers, just a few hundred kilometers short of Russian expansion into Central Asia. We tend to think of Russia as having expanded exponentially in the 19th century, but the British had done the same. So while there are still some final rounds of the Great Game to go, let us stop here to ask, what was this Great Game in which these two empires had considered each other a threat, but used that idea of a threat, the perception of a threat, to expand their own territories and subjugate many other polities. Of course, there was some sense of uncertainty and fear of an enemy striking out from unknown regions on the map, what geographers like to call cartographic anxiety, or the anxiety of blank spaces on the map. So mapping these regions and collecting intelligence about them was a big part of the Great Game, popularized by Rudyard Kipling in his novel Kim. But remember, in the end, a game is played between two players in what is technically called a ludic space, but what we might call a game world or a board, such as a chessboard. Players can thus enter a game world, enter the space of a game, play against each other and exit when they want. In the end, while in the game world they are opponents, in the real world they are actually collaborating and playing by the rules of the game. In this set, the rules of the game were the making of empires. So, this was happening in the Great Game. While purportedly the two empires were opposed to each other, in some sense they were collaborating. Exactly as the closing rounds of the Great Game show. Now, Russia was in the vicinity of British India, almost on the doorstep. What had been prophesied for ages, that Russia was a threat. But what happened when Russia became an actual threat in the neighborhood? Russia and Britain agreed to send a joint commission to collaborate in creating Afghanistan's borders, to close the game that was being played between them. There was one final small scare as a British survey team was mapping Russia's northern boundaries near Merv. The local Russian commander, on his own initiative, attacked an Afghan position in a place known as the Panjshir Oasis and slaughtered dozens of Afghans in their sleep. Remember, Afghanistan was supposed to be under British protection. There was an armed contingent with the British survey team. What did they do? They walked away. The incident was hushed up. The Afghan king was forced to give up Panjshir. And not just Panjshir, the boundary was drawn, and many lands which had been nominally Afghan were being forced, either on the Russian or on the British side, to be given up. In the end, all that remained between these two vast empires was Afghanistan, the boundaries of which country had been drawn by mutual agreement. At their closest, the two empires were separated by a 15-mile corridor on the southeastern edges of Afghanistan, a boundary also shared with China. The two empires called it a game, and in the words of Lord Curzon, who became the new Governor General of British India, the frontier problem had been solved. It had been solved through the creation of a scientific frontier. And now the two empires could rule in peace for ages to come. But that is not what happened, is it? A few years after the closing of the borders, a series of rebellions broke out, and a decade later, the First World War. By the end of the First World War, it was quite clear that Britain would have to exit India, and Tsarist Russia, shattered by revolutions, no longer existed as a regime. Now, what is the lesson for the art of geopolitics here? I've mentioned various insights throughout the narrative about land power, sea power, the interaction between geostrategy, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. But no matter what doctrines are formed, what grand strategies are created, the most important lesson of geopolitics is to not ignore the politics of the geo. If a nation can ensure basic needs of politics, which is a sense of justice in who gets what, where, when, and how, only then can a just state be built. If you don't do so, no matter what edifice you build, it will be hollow from below. Russia's expansion to great power status came with the dark underbelly of millions of exploited serfs. Britain's colonial exploitation had impoverished India to an unimaginable degree. If that is the game you play, history tells us you are bound to lose in the long run.